The courtroom buzzed with an almost electric anticipation as the sun streamed through the high windows of the Los Angeles County Courthouse. It was an otherwise ordinary morning except for one detail: the arrival of Tiffany Halstead. Known for her designer-draped presence and infamous disregard for rules, Tiffany's name had long been a tabloid staple. Today, however, she wasn't posing on a red carpet or flashing a coy smile at the paparazzi. She was here to answer for a series of reckless actions that culminated in endangering a pedestrian. At the helm of this hearing sat Judge William Grant, a man revered for his stern yet measured approach to justice. Tiffany's grand entrance was as ostentatious as expected, late, unapologetic, and wrapped in luxury. She sauntered into the courtroom like it was her runway, her oversized sunglasses shielding eyes that barely acknowledged the murmurs she left in her wake. As she flung her bag down with an air of entitlement, Judge Grant entered, his commanding presence silencing the room. The contrast between her arrogance and his authority painted an unmistakable picture. This wasn't going to be just another slap on the wrist. The stage was set, and justice was about to clash head-on with privilege. Tiffany Halstead was a name synonymous with opulence and scandal. Born into a family of wealth and influence, she had been groomed for a life of privilege from the moment she took her first steps in the halls of their Beverly Hills mansion. Her father, an influential real estate mogul, and her mother, a former fashion model, ensured she had every advantage money could buy. Tiffany had attended the most prestigious schools, though her academic achievements were often overshadowed by whispers of her excessive partying and brazen defiance of authority. In her mid-20s, Tiffany exuded an effortless confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her Instagram profile, a curated gallery of luxury vacations and designer couture, painted the picture of a life untouchable by ordinary concerns. To the public, she was the quintessential socialite, but beneath the polished exterior was a young woman who had never been told no, without a safety net waiting to catch her. Her motto seemed to be, "Rules are for other people." That attitude, however, had landed her in the courtroom of Judge William Grant. Known for his commanding presence and no-nonsense approach to justice, Judge Grant was Tiffany's antithesis in every way. A former prosecutor, Grant's reputation had been built on fairness, intellect, and an unshakable sense of responsibility to the law. While many judges might have been swayed by Tiffany's celebrity or charm, Grant was famously impervious to theatrics, a quality that had earned him both respect and fear in equal measure. At the time of the hearing, Tiffany was at a crossroads she didn't yet recognize. Her latest string of legal troubles had begun innocuously enough with a few unpaid parking tickets but escalated when she recklessly sped through a crowded intersection, narrowly missing a pedestrian. To her, it was an unfortunate inconvenience blown out of proportion. To the public and the court, it was a dangerous act of entitlement. Tiffany's daily routine had been an uninterrupted cycle of brunches, shopping sprees, and exclusive parties. The courtroom, with its rigid decorum and stern-faced officials, was as foreign to her as a factory floor. Her lawyer, a seasoned professional with a clear understanding of the stakes, had warned her to adopt a serious demeanor. But Tiffany, accustomed to brushing off consequences, had ignored his advice. She saw this as another chance to flash a smile, pay a fine, and move on. Judge Grant saw it differently. His courtroom wasn't a stage for dramatics or privilege. It was an arena for accountability. As Tiffany's lawyer shifted nervously beside her, and the bailiff called the room to order, the stark reality began to set in. For Tiffany, this wasn't just another trivial inconvenience. For Judge Grant, it was an opportunity to show that no one, not even a Halstead, was above the law. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy hush, Judge Grant's sharp gaze landed squarely on Tiffany Halstead. She, in turn, leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with an air of defiance. Her oversized sunglasses had been removed, revealing eyes that darted around the room, not with fear, but with mild irritation, as if she were waiting for a tedious business meeting to end. The bailiff read out her charges in a monotone: multiple unpaid parking violations, reckless driving, and endangering a pedestrian. The words seemed to wash over Tiffany as she examined her perfectly manicured nails. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant's voice broke through the stillness like a gavel strike. You've heard the charges brought against you. How do you plead? Tiffany barely glanced up. Not guilty, she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand, her tone dripping with indifference. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Even her lawyer, a seasoned man with graying temples, visibly winced at her tone. Judge Grant's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of something, a quiet resolve, crossed his features. Miss Halstead, I hope you understand the gravity of these charges. This is not about unpaid parking tickets alone. Reckless driving that endangers lives is a serious matter. Tiffany's eyes finally met his, and for a fleeting moment, a spark of irritation lit up her face. With all due respect, Your Honor, no one was hurt, she said, her voice carrying the practiced charm of someone used to getting her way. This whole thing feels like a waste of everyone's time. A gasp escaped from someone in the gallery, and Tiffany's lawyer leaned in urgently, whispering into her ear. She shrugged him off without a second glance. Judge Grant leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled as he studied her. The silence stretched, amplifying the tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but resolute. Miss Halstead, this courtroom is not here to entertain opinions about what you feel is a waste of time. It exists to uphold the law and protect the citizens of this city. Your actions endangered a pedestrian who had every right to cross the street safely. Do you understand that? Tiffany smirked an expression that sent a ripple of discomfort through the courtroom. I understand you have a job to do, Your Honor, she replied. But like I said, no one got hurt. People are just dramatic. Judge Grant's lips pressed into a thin line, but his calm demeanor remained intact. Bailiff, please call Edward Lopez to the stand, he said. The name seemed to catch Tiffany off guard, and for the first time, a hint of unease flickered across her face. From the back of the courtroom, a man in his late 60s slowly made his way forward. Edward Lopez was dressed modestly, his left arm in a sling. His weathered face bore no malice, only a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room as he took the stand. Mr. Lopez, Judge Grant began, could you please recount the events of the day Miss Halstead's actions affected you? Edward nodded, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I was crossing the street, Your Honor, on my way to pick up groceries. I had the light, so I thought it was safe. Then I heard the sound of a car engine revving, and before I knew it, I saw this car coming toward me fast. I stumbled back and fell, landing on my arm. It wasn't broken, but I've been in pain ever since. As he spoke, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Even Tiffany's smirk had vanished, replaced by a blank expression that betrayed her discomfort. Thank you, Mr. Lopez, Judge Grant said, nodding. Do you have anything you would like to say to Miss Halstead? Edward's gaze shifted toward Tiffany, and for a moment, his kind eyes rested on her. I just want her to understand, he said softly. It's not about punishment. It's about realizing that her actions have consequences that affect other people. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence visibly faltering. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was still defensive. Look, I'm sorry if you got scared. That wasn't my intention, she said, her tone lacking sincerity. But I didn't hit you, and I'm not sure why this has turned into such a big deal. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery again, and Judge Grant's patience seemed to thin, though his composure remained. Miss Halstead, he said, his voice firm. Your inability to grasp the severity of this situation is concerning. This is not about what you intended, it is about the impact of your actions. He turned back to Edward. Mr. Lopez, thank you for your testimony. You may step down. As Edward returned to his seat, Judge Grant fixed Tiffany with a look that seemed to pierce straight through her bravado. Miss Halstead, the court has heard enough for today. Your dismissive attitude and lack of accountability are troubling. Tomorrow, we will discuss the consequences of your actions. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on the gravity of the situation you find yourself in. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Tiffany's lawyer began speaking to her in hushed, urgent tones, but her focus was elsewhere. For the first time, the reality of the situation began to creep in. The courtroom emptied, leaving Tiffany seated at the defendant's table, staring blankly ahead, her usual confidence shaken but not yet broken. The following morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was notably different. The initial murmurs and anticipation had given way to a charged tension that seemed to thrum in the air. Tiffany Halstead entered once more, though the confident strut that had marked her arrival the previous day was noticeably subdued. Her designer attire still screamed wealth, but there was an edge of discomfort to her movements, a hesitation as she glanced around at the faces staring back at her. Judge Grant's arrival silenced the room, his presence commanding as he took his seat. "Good morning," he began, his tone even but firm. "Miss Halstead, we are here today to determine an appropriate course of action given your repeated violations and the incident involving Mr. Lopez. Before we proceed, do you have anything further to add to your defense?" Tiffany's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear. She sighed, her annoyance barely masked, and stood. "Your Honor, I regret that Mr. Lopez was frightened by what happened," she began, her voice lacking conviction. "But like I said yesterday, I didn't hit him, and I don't think this situation warrants all this." She gestured vaguely, as if the courtroom, the judge, and the very concept of accountability were an inconvenience. The room remained silent for a moment, Judge Grant's expression unchanging. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Miss Halstead, your words today echoed the dismissive attitude you displayed yesterday. This court is not here to debate the warrant of your actions but to address the consequences of those actions. Your disregard for the safety of others is at the heart of this matter, and it is that disregard we must address." As the judge spoke, Tiffany's carefully crafted veneer began to crack. Her lawyer placed a calming hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "I've said I'm sorry," she snapped, her tone sharper than she likely intended. "What more do you want from me?" Judge Grant's calm demeanor did not waver. "I want you to understand, Miss Halstead. That is what this court wants. And until you do, we cannot move forward constructively." At that moment, the door to the courtroom opened, and a woman entered, carrying a folder. She walked briskly to the judge's bench, handing him the folder before stepping back. Judge Grant opened it, scanning its contents briefly before setting it down. "Miss Halstead," he said, "this folder contains character witness statements, accounts of previous incidents where your actions have displayed a troubling pattern of disregard for others. Would you care to hear them?" Tiffany's expression shifted, her confidence visibly faltering. "Character witnesses?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You mean people digging up dirt on me? How is that fair?" Judge Grant's gaze was unyielding. "Fairness is precisely why we are here, Miss Halstead. The question before this court is whether you are willing to take responsibility for your actions and learn from them." The tension in the room seemed to intensify as the first statement was read aloud by the judge. It detailed an incident where Tiffany had verbally berated a valet for taking too long with her car, a tirade that ended with her threatening to get him fired. Another statement followed, recounting a time she had thrown a drink at a server who had brought her the wrong cocktail. As each statement was read, Tiffany's posture grew more rigid. Her carefully crafted mask of indifference cracked further with every damning account. The gallery watched in silence, the weight of the words filling the room like a tangible presence. "Enough," Tiffany said suddenly, her voice louder than intended. She stood, her hands gripping the edges of the table. "This has nothing to do with what happened with Mr. Lopez. You're all just piling on because I'm me." Judge Grant's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Miss Halstead, this court is not interested in who you are. It is interested in who you choose to be from this point forward. The pattern of behavior outlined here speaks to a lack of accountability, and it is that pattern we must address if we are to ensure that no one else is endangered by your actions." Tiffany's lawyer pulled her gently back into her seat, whispering something to her that seemed to quell her immediate outburst. The judge continued. "Miss Halstead, this court recognizes that punitive measures alone are unlikely to result in meaningful change. Therefore, in addition to fines and community service, I am assigning you a mandatory 6-week program at the Downtown Rehabilitation and Accountability Center." "A program?" Tiffany asked, her voice incredulous. "What kind of program?" "A program designed to teach empathy and accountability," Judge Grant replied. "You will participate in workshops, meet individuals whose lives have been profoundly impacted by reckless behavior, and reflect on the choices that brought you here. Additionally, you will spend 1 day a week volunteering at the downtown women's shelter." The gallery buzzed with murmurs at this unexpected sentence. Tiffany's lawyer looked stunned, but he quickly masked his reaction. Tiffany, however, was less restrained. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "Volunteering? Workshops? This is ridiculous." Judge Grant's voice cut through her protests like a blade. "Miss Halstead, your refusal to acknowledge the impact of your actions leaves this court with little choice. This sentence is not just about consequences, it is about gallowing you to change. The alternative is incarceration. The decision is yours." The word incarceration hung in the air, silencing Tiffany's protests. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in her eyes. She glanced at her lawyer, who nodded solemnly. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight with anger. "I'll do it." Judge Grant nodded. "Then we are adjourned. Your program begins Monday morning. Do not be late." The gavel came down, and the courtroom began to empty. Tiffany remained seated, her mind racing. She had expected fines, maybe a warning. This felt like a public spectacle. But as she glanced around, she saw no gloating faces, only serious expressions that mirrored Judge Grant's. Perhaps, she thought, this wasn't about humiliating her. Perhaps it was about something far more unsettling: accountability. The following days were a whirlwind. Monday morning arrived too quickly, and Tiffany found herself standing outside the Downtown Rehabilitation and Accountability Center. The building was unassuming, its brick facade a stark contrast to the opulent venues she usually frequented. Inside, she was greeted by a woman named Carla, the program coordinator. "Welcome, Miss Halstead," Carla said, her tone neutral but firm. "You'll be assigned a schedule of workshops and activities. This is not a punishment. It's a chance for you to understand the impact of your actions and grow from this experience. I suggest you approach it with an open mind." Tiffany barely managed a polite nod. As the day unfolded, she attended her first workshop, where a mother who had lost her son to a reckless driver shared her story. The raw emotion in the room was overwhelming, and for the first time, Tiffany found herself unable to dismiss it as dramatic. Her time at the women's shelter proved equally challenging. She served meals to women who had lost everything, their stories quietly unfolding as they sat together. At first, Tiffany kept her distance, unwilling to engage. But slowly, the barriers she had built began to erode. One woman, a former nurse named Maria, shared how a single moment of carelessness had upended her life. "It's not about how big the mistake is," Maria said softly. "It's about what you do after." That night, Tiffany lay awake, Maria's words replaying in her mind. For the first time, she began to see beyond her perspective. The world she had dismissed as dramatic was filled with people carrying burdens she had never imagined. And perhaps, she thought, it was time to stop running from her own. Tiffany Halstead's second week at the Downtown Rehabilitation and Accountability Center began with a palpable shift in the air. The initial indignation she had carried into her mandated workshops and volunteer shifts had started to dissipate. It wasn't that she had embraced the experience with open arms, far from it, but something unnameable was gnawing at her usual bravado. She walked into the center that morning clutching a cup of overpriced coffee, her heels clicking against the tile floor, but her gaze flickered uncertainly around the room. "Good morning, Miss Halstead," Carla greeted her with a knowing smile. "Today's schedule includes a discussion session on accountability, followed by your shift at the shelter. Afterward, we'll reconvene for an individual reflection exercise." Tiffany muttered a noncommittal reply and took her usual seat at the back of the workshop room. The morning session opened with a video of families affected by reckless driving. One story centered on a teenager whose life had been forever altered by an accident eerily similar to the one Tiffany had narrowly avoided causing. The girl's mother spoke through tears, recounting her daughter's struggles to regain mobility and the emotional toll on their family. For the first time, Tiffany didn't roll her eyes or check her phone. She stared at the screen, her grip tightening around the styrofoam cup in her hand. When the video ended, Carla turned to the group. "Recklessness isn't always about malice," Carla began, her voice calm but firm. "It's about not thinking, not seeing, not understanding the ripple effects of our actions. Let's talk about what we just saw." The group discussion meandered through familiar topics: guilt, regret, and the difficulty of facing those we've hurt. When it was Tiffany's turn to speak, she hesitated. All eyes turned toward her, expectant and wary. She started, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I never thought about it that way before." Carla nodded, encouraging her to continue. Tiffany swallowed hard. "I mean, I've always just assumed people get over things. That things aren't as bad as they make them out to be." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. "Do you think Mr. Lopez has gotten over his injury?" Carla asked gently. Tiffany's face flushed. "No," she admitted. "I don't think he has." The session moved on, but Tiffany's thoughts remained tangled in the video and Carla's question. As she walked to the downtown women's shelter for her shift, her usual shield of indifference felt flimsy and inadequate. The shelter was busier than usual that afternoon. Tiffany found herself working alongside Maria, the former nurse whose story of rebuilding her life had struck a chord. Maria's kindness was unassuming, her resilience evident in her easy smile and calm demeanor as she moved through the dining area, greeting guests by name. "You're quiet today," Maria observed as they set up for the lunch service. "Just thinking," Tiffany replied, her tone less clipped than usual. Maria nodded knowingly. "Thinking is good. It's the first step to seeing things." As they served lunch, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A young woman, barely older than Tiffany, had entered, clutching a toddler in her arms. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice trembling as she asked for help. Maria stepped forward immediately, her calm presence soothing the distraught woman. Tiffany hovered nearby, unsure of how to help. She watched as Maria gently guided the woman to a seat, offering her water and a kind ear. The toddler clung to his mother, his wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Tiffany's heart ached at the sight, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. Later, Maria filled her in. "She's escaping an abusive situation," Maria explained. "No money, no support system. Just trying to protect her baby. It's not uncommon, unfortunately." Tiffany's chest tightened. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you see things like that every day and not break?" Maria smiled softly. "I've broken plenty of times. But you learn to pick up the pieces. And you keep going because someone has to." Tiffany's reflection exercise that evening was more honest than anything she had written in years. For the first time, she admitted to herself that her actions had consequences she hadn't considered. She wrote about Mr. Lopez, the teenage girl in the video, and the young mother at the shelter. She didn't know what to do with the feelings churning inside her, but she knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. The following week, the program introduced Tiffany to its toughest component: direct interaction with victims of reckless behavior. She was paired with a group of individuals who had experienced life-altering consequences from accidents caused by carelessness. Among them was a man named David, who had lost his wife and son in a car crash 5 years earlier. His voice trembled as he recounted the incident, his pain palpable. "I'm not here to make anyone feel bad," David said, his eyes meeting Tiffany's. "I just want people to realize that every choice we make matters. Every single one." Tiffany's chest tightened again, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. For the first time, she spoke without pretense. "I don't know if I can ever make up for what I've done," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life thinking my actions didn't affect anyone else. But they do. I see that now." David's expression softened. Seeing it is the first step, he said. What you do with that realization is what matters. By the end of the session, Tiffany felt raw, as though the walls she had so carefully built around herself had been torn down brick by brick. She wasn't sure of who she was without them, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany threw herself into the program with a determination that surprised even her. She volunteered extra hours at the shelter, learning the names and stories of the women she served. She participated actively in workshops, sharing uncharacteristically vulnerable insights. Slowly, the icy barrier between her and the world around her began to thaw. Her final reflection exercise marked a turning point. I came here thinking this was just a punishment, she wrote. A way to embarrass me, to make an example out of me. But now I see it's not about punishment at all. It's about growth. About understanding that the world doesn't revolve around me. And maybe, just maybe, it's about learning to be better. When Tiffany stood before Judge Grant after her program, she was no longer the defiant socialite who had sauntered into his courtroom weeks earlier. She spoke with sincerity, her voice steady but humble. Thank you, she said, for not giving up on me. For making me see what I couldn't see before. Judge Grant's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. The real thanks, Miss Halstead, will come in how you choose to live your life from this point forward. This program was only the beginning. The rest is up to you. As she left the courtroom that day, Tiffany felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. For the first time, she understood the weight of her actions, and the responsibility that came with them. Tiffany Halstead's final week of the accountability program loomed ahead like an uncharted horizon. The weeks she had spent at the downtown rehabilitation and accountability center, and the women's shelter had changed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but now came the real test. The program's culminating exercise, a public forum where participants were required to present their reflections, felt impossibly daunting. This is your chance, Carla explained during their one-on-one session. You've done the work, Tiffany. Now, it's about showing yourself and others what you've learned. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, she admitted. I don't know how to talk about this without sounding fake. Carla gave her a small, encouraging smile. The only way to sound genuine is to be genuine. Speak from the heart. People will know the difference. The forum was scheduled for Friday evening, and as the week progressed, Tiffany found herself replaying every lesson, every story, and every emotion she had encountered over the past 6 weeks. The faces of Maria, the young mother from the shelter, and David, who had lost his family to a reckless driver, lingered in her mind. She thought of Mr. Lopez, his quiet dignity as he recounted his ordeal in the courtroom, and of Carla's relentless yet compassionate guidance. These people had become more than fleeting presences in her life. They had become mirrors, reflecting truths she could no longer ignore. By Friday morning, the shelter's staff had organized a farewell lunch for Tiffany. It was a simple affair, sandwiches and homemade cookies, but the warmth in the room was palpable. Maria handed her a small card, handwritten and carefully folded. Tiffany hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding as she read the words inside. You have more strength than you know. Thank you for listening, and for trying. Keep going. Maria. The simple note brought tears to Tiffany's eyes, and she found herself hugging Maria before she even realized she had moved. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. For everything. As she walked out of the shelter for the last time, Tiffany's mind was clearer than it had been in years. She no longer felt the crushing weight of expectation or the need to perform a version of herself that others expected. Instead, she felt a quiet resolve. The forum wasn't about redemption or proving anything to anyone. It was about truth. That evening, the forum room buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of chairs faced a modest podium, and the audience, composed of other participants, their families, and program staff, waited patiently for the event to begin. Tiffany sat near the back, clutching the index cards she had scribbled on earlier in the day. She hadn't planned to use them, but holding on to something tangible steadied her trembling hands. Carla stepped up to the podium to open the event, her voice calm and steady. "Tonight, we celebrate growth and accountability," she began. "The individuals you'll hear from have faced difficult truths, and their courage to reflect and share is what makes this program so impactful." One by one, participants took the stage. Each story was unique, yet they shared common threads of remorse, resilience, and a commitment to change. Tiffany listened intently, her heart pounding harder with every passing speaker. She felt both inspired and intimidated by their bravery. Finally, Carla called her name. "Tiffany Halstead." Tiffany stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The room seemed to stretch endlessly as she made her way to the podium. Taking a deep breath, she placed her cards on the lectern but didn't look down at them. Instead, she faced the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had become her unlikely support system. "I came here 6 weeks ago thinking this was all a waste of time," she began, her voice shaky but gaining strength. "I thought it was just another punishment, another way to make me feel small. I didn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal out of something that, to me, felt like nothing." She paused, scanning the audience. Carla nodded encouragingly from her seat. "But it wasn't nothing," Tiffany continued. "I see that now. What I did affected people. It hurt people. And for so long, I didn't want to see that because it was easier to pretend my actions didn't matter. But they do. They always have." Her voice wavered, and she gripped the edges of the podium. "I've met people here who have faced unimaginable pain because of choices people like me made. I've heard their stories, and for the first time I couldn't just shrug it off. I couldn't keep pretending that it wasn't real." Tiffany's gaze drifted to David, who nodded solemnly, his arms crossed over his chest. "To everyone I've hurt, directly or indirectly, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but it's where I need to start. I'm not the same person who walked into Judge Grant's courtroom weeks ago, and for that I'm grateful. I'm grateful to the people here who have been patient with me, who have shown me what accountability means." She stepped back from the podium, her heart racing, and the room erupted into applause. Tiffany's cheeks burned, but she felt a strange lightness she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't relief or pride, it was something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement that she had taken the first step toward becoming the person she wanted to be. After the forum, as people mingled and shared words of encouragement, Tiffany found herself face to face with David. "You meant what you said up there," he observed, his voice steady. She nodded. "I did. And I'm going to keep trying to mean it. Every day." David extended his hand, and Tiffany shook it firmly. "That's all anyone can ask." As Tiffany left the center that night, the city lights stretched before her, and for the first time, they didn't feel like a backdrop to a performance. They felt like the beginning of a new story, one where she could finally step into the light as herself. The day Tiffany Halstead returned to Judge Grant's courtroom marked the final chapter of her mandated journey through accountability. She stood before the bench, no longer the defiant socialite who had dismissed her reckless actions as trivial inconveniences. Her designer wardrobe was muted, and her posture, while still poised, carried a humility that had been absent before. Judge Grant glanced over the file before him, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice measured, "you've completed the accountability program as ordered. This court has received reports from the program coordinators, as well as testimony from those you've worked with. Before we proceed, I'd like to hear from you. What have you learned from this experience?" Tiffany took a deep breath. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but soft. "When I first came here, I didn't think I had done anything wrong. I thought everyone was overreacting. But now I see that my actions, and my attitude, were selfish and dangerous. I wasn't just breaking rules, I was putting people's lives at risk." She paused, her throat tightening. "During the program, I met people who've lost everything because of reckless behavior. I heard their stories, and I saw the pain they've carried because someone else didn't think about the consequences of their actions. It made me realize how much harm I've caused, and how much I took for granted. Judge Grant's sharp eyes studied her, but he said nothing, prompting her to continue. I've also learned that accountability isn't just about saying you're sorry. It's about doing better every day. It's about making choices that don't just serve yourself but consider how they affect others. I know I still have a long way to go, but I want to do better. Her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. For the first time, Tiffany didn't care about how she looked or sounded. She cared about the truth. Judge Grant nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Thank you, Miss Halstead. Your words reflect significant growth, but actions matter more than words. That's why this court places great weight on the testimony of those who have witnessed your journey firsthand. He turned to Carla, who had been invited to speak as a representative of the accountability program. Rising from her seat, Carla addressed the court with calm authority. Your Honor, I've seen many participants come through our program, but Tiffany stands out. At first, she resisted the process, as many do. But over time, she showed genuine effort and self-reflection. She not only completed her assignments but went beyond what was required, volunteering extra hours at the shelter and engaging meaningfully with those she served. I believe her transformation is sincere. The courtroom murmured at Carla's words. Judge Grant's expression remained stoic, but his nod indicated he valued the testimony. Finally, Judge Grant spoke. Miss Halstead, this court recognizes the progress you've made. Accountability is not a destination, it is a journey. What you've done over these past weeks is commendable, but the true test will be in how you live your life moving forward. I'm concluding this case with the understanding that you will continue to uphold the principles you've learned. Should you fail to do so, you may find yourself back in this courtroom under less favorable circumstances. Tiffany nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Judge Grant's gavel came down with a decisive crack, signaling the end of her case. As Tiffany left the courtroom, the weight of finality settled on her shoulders. Reporters lingered outside, their cameras flashing, but she didn't stop to pose or offer sound bites. For once, she wasn't interested in the spotlight. Instead, she focused on the path ahead, determined to prove, to herself and the world, that she could be more than the sum of her past mistakes. The weeks following Tiffany Halstead's final court appearance were quieter than she had anticipated. For someone used to the clamor of parties and the constant buzz of social media notifications, the stillness felt both foreign and welcome. She had deactivated her accounts, at least temporarily, and spent her days reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Tiffany's routine now included weekly visits to the downtown women's shelter, a commitment she had chosen to continue voluntarily. The staff, once wary of her intentions, had come to see her as a genuine ally. She didn't shy away from the hard work anymore, whether it was scrubbing floors, serving meals, or listening to the stories of the women she had once dismissed as strangers to her world. The connection she built there felt more real than any she'd forged at high society galas. One afternoon, as she sat with Maria over coffee in the shelter's modest break room, Tiffany found herself opening up. I used to think the world owed me something, she admitted. But now I see how much I've taken for granted. I'm not proud of the person I was, but I'm trying to change. Maria smiled warmly. Change isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and using it to be better. The words stuck with Tiffany as she navigated the delicate process of rebuilding her life. She reached out to Mr. Lopez, the pedestrian she had endangered, to offer a sincere apology. To her surprise, he accepted it graciously, his quiet forgiveness leaving an indelible mark on her. Just remember, he told her, it's what you do next that matters. Tiffany also began exploring ways to use her privilege for good. She partnered with the accountability program to create a scholarship fund for victims of reckless driving and their families, a small step toward making amends. Though she knew money couldn't undo the harm she'd caused, she hoped it could provide opportunities for those who needed it most. Her transformation didn't happen overnight, and there were moments when she stumbled, moments when old habits threatened to resurface. But each time, she reminded herself of the faces she had seen, the stories she had heard, and the lessons she had learned. Months later, As Tiffany walked past the tabloid stand, she noticed a headline about her, a rare occurrence these days. Instead of a scandal or an outburst, it highlighted her community work. She didn't stop to buy the magazine, but the sight brought a small, fleeting smile to her face. It wasn't validation she sought anymore, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was trying to be better. For the first time in her life, Tiffany wasn't running from her mistakes. She was learning to live beyond them. If Tiffany's journey of accountability and transformation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change and reflection. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. What would you have done in Tiffany's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the discussion. Your perspective can spark meaningful conversations. Did you catch all the pivotal moments in Tiffany's story? Tell us your favorite part in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this story with someone who could use a little inspiration today.